It's time that we got underway. I'd like to welcome everybody today. My name's David Walker, and I'm the Executive Director of the School of Policy Studies, and we're here for the J. Douglas Gibson Lecture. As I welcome you to the lecture, I recognize with gratitude that we live and work on the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples. This privilege makes possible our place of discovery and learning. The J. Douglas Gibson Lecture Series was established in 1988 by family and friends to honor the memory of J. Douglas Gibson. Mr. Gibson was chair of Queen's University's Board of Trustees from 1969 to 1975. A banker economist, he's remembered for many things. One notably was something he said on the occasion of receiving an honorary degree from Queen's. He remarked on the, I quote, wave of sentiment against universities, unquotes, in Canada, that they were, quotes, no longer the darlings of politicians, end quotes. He urged more adaptation to the facts of the world in which we live. Seems to me those words are as true now as they were then. The Gibson Lecture brings to Queen's an internationally renowned scholar or public figure to deliver a public lecture on a topic relevant to this school's mandate, and has over the years, as it does today, featured many very distinguished speakers. I also would like to welcome members of Mr. Gibson's family, Don and Doug, here today. Doug and I were at medical school together at Queen's a couple of years ago, and it's nice to be able to catch up. We're profoundly grateful to your family for this legacy and the opportunity to be engaged on policy challenges important to this country and the world. So I will now hand over to Cara Waits, who will introduce our special guest, the J. Douglas Gibson Lecturer for 2018.
Thank you, Dr. Walker. My name's Cara Waits, and I am a Master's of Public Administration candidate here at the School of Policy Studies. I'm very excited to introduce our esteemed speaker for the 2018 J. Douglas Gibson Lecture, Dr. Robert Wolfe. Professor Robert Wolfe has an extensive career in foreign affairs and academia. Professor Wolfe joined the then Department of External Affairs in 1976 as a Foreign Service officer in the political economic stream, serving abroad in Bangladesh and in the Canadian delegation to the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development in Paris. In Ottawa, he worked in national security, U.S. trade and economic relations, as executive assistant to the ambassador for multilateral trade negotiations and Prime Minister's personal representative, and in international economic relations. Professor Wolfe joined the School of Policy Studies in 1995 and retired just last year. Professor Wolfe has a BA in history from York University, an MA in Canadian Studies from Carleton, and a doctorate in political studies from Queen's University. He has made important contributions to the school through his research, teaching, and his time as director. Professor Wolfe is a fellow of the Center for International and Defense Policy at Queen's, a research fellow of the Institute for Research on Public Policy, a member of the editorial board of World Trade Review, and a member of the Trade Expert Advisory Council with Global Affairs Canada. He has been the lead director of the Queen's Institute on Trade Policy since 2009. His ongoing research interests include Canadian trade policy, the World Trade Organization, and transparency mechanisms. I am sure Dr. Wolfe's insights on NAFTA negotiations will inspire many questions from our audience today, as it's something we're seeing in the news every day, and I can assure you we've talked about in almost all of our classes this year. Throughout the talk, you can submit questions at slido.com or using the Slido app. The Slido code for today, as per our usual MPA speaker series, is MPA 18. We will take questions from Slido and from the audience at the end of the presentation. Now, please join me in welcoming our speaker today, Professor Robert Wolfe.
Well, thank you. Thank you all for coming. I've been to many Gibson lectures. I never met Mr. Gibson. I met his wife many times when she came to these lectures. And I know that Mrs. Gibson especially enjoyed the lectures on international economic topics because of her own training and experience. I hope that she would have enjoyed this lecture. I suspect also that Mr. Gibson would be interested. In 1948, he edited a collection of essays by eminent Canadian economists called Canada's Economy in a Changing World. Contributors to that book proposed a range of options for trade relations with the US, and I don't think any of those contributors would be surprised by where we are now. Professor Walker has already acknowledged that we are on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee. The point is relevant for the talk today. As Chief Perry Bellegarde said in August, we never created borders. We've always had a lot of international trade amongst ourselves as Indigenous peoples, and they did it without borders, and so they didn't need trade policy. My talk will have 7 sections, and I hope I can keep them straight for you as we go along. We have to talk about NAFTA, why we have to talk about NAFTA. I'll give you a bit of an orientation to how I think about trade policy, then why we find ourselves in this situation in the negotiation, the agenda for the negotiation. I'll talk about a few issues that illustrate the tension that interests me between modernization and negotiation. Probably the question that's top of mind is, can we be bullied by our friends to the south? And then some scenarios for how this plays out. We live in very interesting times, which is not always a good thing. But the skirmishes that we've been seeing so far do not yet amount to a trade war. But it's been really hard to keep up with the chaotic policy process in Washington. So I'm not going to try to predict what the outcome will be. I'm not even going to try to predict what this afternoon's tweets will be. But here's just a few of the headlines for the past week as I've been trying to finish this presentation. So Trump is going to announce the tariffs, then he's not going to announce the tariffs, then he's going to implement the tariffs in a loving way, then they're not going to be imposed on Canada. Now the tariffs that his aides are working on China aren't big enough, he wants more. And he's just appointed a new economic advisor. The bad news is he doesn't like Trudeau. The good news is he likes NAFTA. I can't stand this. So is a trade war coming? Well, we're not there yet. Subsidies and dumping rules, known as trade remedy, operate according to multilateral rules. Softwood lumber is an egregious example, but it's legal. Bombardier is winning its case against Boeing for now. The so-called safeguards that have been imposed on washing machines and solar panels are poorly conceived, but they too aren't a disaster and they're semi-legal. The claims for protection of steel and aluminum on spurious national security grounds, that's going to hurt US workers and consumers. No trade expert agrees that this protection is warranted. No security expert thinks it's needed. Canada and Mexico have been exempted for now, as you know, with an explicit threat that the continued exemption is linked to NAFTA. While the tariffs Trump announced last week create the risk of other countries negotiating outside the WTO framework, what he's thinking about doing on China could be worse, and there are real risks that China and other countries are going to retaliate against the tariffs that we're now facing, and that could lead to something that would look like what journalists call a trade war, but as I said, we're not there as I'm speaking. These events are big news in Canada because the prosperity and growth of our small open economy depends on international trade and investment. The dotted line at the top shows trade in goods alone is equal to about half of our GDP, and trade with the US is equal to about 30% of our GDP. We live in an era of free trade agreements. Note the large dark blue segment, that's NAFTA. It's great that the Canada-EU agreement, known as CETA, is now being implemented, but that's representing a relatively small part of our trade. The Trans-Pacific Partnership that was signed last week in Santiago will be valuable, as would be a deal with China. But NAFTA is clearly our most important trade agreement after the World Trade Organization, which is our trade agreement with the whole world. These numbers, the large number for NAFTA, is not surprising. Countries tend to trade with their nearest neighbors, especially if that neighbor is one of the largest and most dynamic economies in the world. The biggest risk to Canada in the current situation is a thickening border. If it becomes harder for all sorts of reasons to sell in the US, then we're at risk of North American disintegration. So we have to talk about NAFTA, which is usually a topic that makes most people's eyes glaze over, but here we are. Briefly, what is NAFTA? It's been in force since January 1, 1994. It covers goods, trade and services, standards, and intellectual property. Tariffs on all goods were eliminated with the exception of some agricultural tariffs. And the result is a tripling in merchandise trade to a merchandise relationship alone that's now worth over $1 trillion a year. Nobody thinks that an agreement negotiated in the early 1990s is good enough for 21st century trade. Canada and Mexico saw the original Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations as useful because, in effect, it was a traditional trade negotiation, but it was based on the latest academic thinking about 21st century trade issues, and it was aimed at modernizing NAFTA. A modernized NAFTA could be what I'm calling a model for enhanced North American integration. What causes us difficulty is the US demand to renegotiate NAFTA with the objective to improve the US trade balance and reduce the trade deficit with NAFTA countries. Renegotiation under this kind of circumstance is a novel approach to negotiations that we haven't seen before. It's not based on accepted academic thinking. It's not based on accepted negotiation tactics. It addresses old issues in an old, narrow way. This objective could lead to North American disintegration. It could harm supply chains that crisscross borders. It could increase business uncertainty. It would decrease the ability to invest in one place in the North American area to serve the whole continent. As I go along, try to keep in your head this tension between modernization and renegotiation. Last year, so now I'm switching it to part 2 of my talk, how do I think about Canadian trade policy? I was one of the co-editors of this study on Canadian trade that was published last year. A lot of think tank projects start from the assumption that more trade is possible with some fast-growing part of the world if we just randomly pick some set of actions to that end. We consciously designed this research program with a different aim. We wanted to draw out the implications for growth and for productivity of new thinking about firms and new thinking about global value chains. We asked our authors to assess how the world had changed, and only then to think about what the policy implications would be for Canada. Our starting point for recommendations was that trade and trade policy is not an end in itself. An inclusive trade policy works in support of the government's broader objective of inclusive growth. Trade policy on its own can't and shouldn't be expected to address all of the many economic problems that we face. Dealing with the Americans may be an existential crisis, but we can't forget this overarching reality. Traditional trade policy has to work in support of complementary tools that deal with all the other things that matter for the government's economic agenda. Our recommendations were grouped in 4 pillars. The government's progressive trade agenda falls under the first pillar, including the impact of trade on gender, labor, environment, and Indigenous peoples. When national competitiveness is invoked as a policy objective, trade people respond that countries don't trade, firms trade. And they do it in global value chains. Analysis now makes a tight link between trade and productivity, and that's where thinking on what Canada might want to achieve, offensively or defensively in NAFTA, has to begin. Trade needs bridges, and it needs mechanisms to make it easier for things to cross borders. And trade agreements finally come last, not first. They don't cause trade flows to change, but they can reduce uncertainty for governments and for firms. It's perhaps not surprising that trade deals have become a political target, given economic anxiety about trade and globalization, even if trade agreements are not to blame for the things that create the anxiety. But that's one of the reasons that so many trade negotiations are struggling at the moment. Even if trade policy can't address these concerns, even without President Trump, this is a tough time for trade negotiators. So, why are we here? I need to talk about some of the ideas that animate the president, otherwise we can't understand the motivation for the renegotiation, or why that motivation is problematic for Canada and Mexico. During his election campaign, the president promised to fix NAFTA. He also promised to pull out of TPP, which he did immediately, and now we're living with the other objective. President Trump and his Secretary of Commerce believe some strange things. Mr. Ross thinks that steel and aluminum tariffs won't increase the price of soup or beer cans. He's wrong. The president believes that foreign barriers are unfair to the United States, that trade deals are stacked against the United States, and that the US trade deficit is evidence of this unfairness. He thinks exports are good, they're like a revenue for the United States, and that imports are bad, they're like a cost for the United States. He's utterly wrong. Both imports and exports are a value to the economy. Robert Lighthizer is the US trade representative. Under Trump, he had been a more junior official there in the 1980s under Ronald Reagan. As a lawyer in private practice, he worked for, in the intervening years, he worked for declining industries like steel that exploit those trade remedy laws for protection, and he has surrounded himself with such people. He believes that US trade policy has been all wrong since 1994, that is NAFTA and the World Trade Organization. Indeed, he thinks the WTO was a mistake and it needs to be fixed. He thinks China poses an existential threat to the United States and to the global economy. And he thinks life was actually pretty good in the 1980s when the Reagan administration could just bully its trading partners to do what they wanted instead of having to negotiate. Indeed, since the 1980s, the United States has been less and less interested in playing a system-sustaining role of making the multilateral system works. But this is the first administration that has had such an outright economic nationalist orientation. I have to pause on the trade deficit because it's so important in the thinking of this administration. Lighthizer says if you have enormous, unprecedentedly large deficits that go on for decades, you're basically losing your jobs, you're losing your wealth, and that's what bothers the president. He may be right that that's what the president thinks. Trump has thought it for a long time. He's not going to change, but he's wrong on the economics. The president is also wrong in the detail. The US does not have a trade deficit with Canada, although we learned this morning that he knows that he has no idea about the trade deficit with Canada. He just makes it up. So here's the facts from a recent source. The US doesn't have a deficit with Canada if you count both goods and services. That's Canada on the left. And that this data is at least according to a recent report that perhaps the president hasn't had time to read. But bilateral deficits are in any event mostly irrelevant, because if the US wasn't buying the goods and services from Canada, they'd be buying them from somewhere else. The US has a current account deficit because foreigners send Americans goods and services. Trade policy cannot lower the trade deficit unless it raises US savings, something that's not even vaguely possible, or lowers US investment, which is certainly unlikely given the tax bill, which is designed to increase investment. That bill is going to raise the budget deficit, as will the budget bill that the president presented to Congress. It'll get changed, but still the Republican orientation of fiscal policy is to raise the budget deficit. That will have an inevitable result. The trade deficit is going to rise. If you want to understand the economics, this brief published in the last few days by Bob Lawrence is really an excellent primer on how this works. So back to NAFTA. I'll talk a little bit about the process, which is fairly opaque, because what you see on TV obscures the work of hundreds of people. The NAFTA negotiations actually take place on many levels. The structure on the right is normal for complex negotiations. In the end, leaders will make the tough decisions, but oversight of each round comes from ministers. Meanwhile, Congress plays a huge role in US trade policy, so the lines here are not necessarily directional. In Canada, Chrystia Freeland is the lead minister for the US, not Minister Champagne. She appears periodically before parliamentary committees, as do officials. There's all kinds of stakeholder consultations and advisory groups on both sides. I'm part of just one of them. Responsibility for trade under the US Constitution is with Congress, but complex negotiations have to be carried out by the president, and nobody would negotiate with the president if the results could be picked apart in Congress. So periodically they give him authority, which in this case runs out on July 1. He will request renewal, and they will give it to him. The current law provides for an up or down vote on the whole package. If certain procedural steps are followed before and during the negotiations, and after the president provides 90 days notice to Congress. That means that if, by chance, they reach an agreement in principle next month, and if it's notified to Congress in April, it might get a vote this year before the midterm elections. Any later for notification to Congress, and it would get tied up in the midterm election cycle. Hence, that's why there's now pressure for getting this done quickly. That trade promotion legislation requires the USTR to notify Congress before it launches negotiations with a statement of the objectives, and that's the US list there in detail. Those objectives have to reflect the authority that was in the legislation passed in 2015. Canada and Mexico don't have similar requirements. The world is getting used to the president's art of the deal. It's like nothing we've ever seen before. We had barely tabled initial ideas in August, and the president wanted to bail out on those negotiations. He was at it again in October. Negotiators try to ignore the noise from the tweets. Lighthizer is enough to manage. There have been 4 increasingly acrimonious rounds from August through October. They kept ministers away in November, and so it was a little quieter. And then they had what they called an intercessional round in December that was quieter and more professional still. The formal 6th round in Montreal in January involved ministers again just at the end. That's where you heard Mr. Lighthizer lamenting the slow pace of negotiations. Canada has said one of the reasons the negotiations are going slowly is because the United States is trying to go too fast. I think he's right. The trade negotiations are complex and can't be rushed. The 7th round in Mexico earlier this month made limited progress. And so there's an 8th round, we think, coming sometime in mid-April, and that's meant to wrap things up. The first trade negotiator's cliche, you'll hear it millions of times if you talk to people like me, the devil is in the details. So now I'm going to talk about just a few of the issues in the negotiation to give you a sense of what's going on. So where are we? Some technical issues have been closed, that is, those chapters in the eventual agreement are considered complete. Some of the modernization issues are easy to close. I'll discuss digital trade in a moment. The issues I've listed as not clear are ones that fit on what the government calls its progressive trade agenda, and the starred issues are ones that matter for Democrats in Congress. Lighthizer said at the end of the March round that we believe that NAFTA should be rebalanced. This has been a long-standing US concern about the treatment of our workers and businesses. From our point of view, among other things, changing the agreement so that it no longer encourages outsourcing, developing rules of origin that will fairly treat our manufacturing sector and workers, and reshaping the rules of government procurement are very important. These are the toughest issues in the renegotiation dimension, and I'll talk about the ones in red in a moment. But first, a key modernization issue. Every free trade agreement now, every negotiation, talks about digital trade or e-commerce. There's dozens of models out there. Times have changed since we negotiated the first NAFTA. You may recall, some of you, those who were born, this famous cartoon from the 1990s. It's been updated. We've all had We've all had occasion to worry about how Google seems to follow us around. Consumer worries about online privacy, data breaches, declining trust, and measures to control data security. These are really domestic policy issues. But the need for coordination between countries to allow digital trade is what brings them into trade agreements. It's easier for Canada. Our Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act does not prohibit the transfer of personal information to an organization in another jurisdiction for processing, but the transferring organization in Canada remains accountable for the information. The US has a patchwork of privacy provisions in certain sectoral laws, but nothing overarching, and none of them are anywhere near being the responsibility of USTR, so they find it very difficult to negotiate digital trade. Canada and the US reached an accommodation in the TPP negotiations, and so far as we know, the TPP chapter is the basis for the NAFTA renegotiation. Rules on data localization were framed in TPP in obligatory or legally enforceable terms. Given the US patchwork, protection of personal information was only on a best endeavors or a non-obligatory basis. The other issues are more technical, but they also have a big impact on 21st century trade. I did say that the devil is in the details. If e-commerce is part of a modernization agenda, automobiles is very much renegotiation. Autos may look like an old economy issue, but it isn't. To explain why, and why it's so contentious in NAFTA, we now really need to go into the weeds. This image of where the parts come from in a Volvo illustrates how auto assembly plants are merely the last link in complex value chains, which is true actually for most manufacturing now, which is why talking only about trade in goods and not trade in services makes no sense. Some of the Canadian auto export is parts imported from elsewhere. Some of the parts imported from Canada end up embedded in US exports. And this image only shows goods, not services, but services are the largest part of our economy now. Canada is the black bar on all the lines in this slide. The gray is OECD countries as a whole. Services is the largest part of employment in Canada, 86%, something similar in the United States. Even if the share of manufacturing in employment was increased by Trump's trade policies by, say, 15%, it would have little overall impact because services is the largest part of the economy. On the bottom line of this chart, pure services exports are only 16% of Canada's overall exports, but 45% of the value that's added in Canada to the things we export is services. Some officials in the EU are now calling that Mode 5. The rules and trade agreements on services are phrased in terms of modes of supply as they were understood by negotiators in the early 1990s. So Mode 1 is when a service crosses the border. We design a car in Canada, it gets built somewhere else. Mode 2 is when any one of us goes to the United States, say, as a tourist, that will show up in the data as an export of services from the United States to Canada. Mode 3 would be, for example, a design firm sets up shop in the United States. Mode 4 could be after-sales support from the designer of a part who has to go to the United States to provide that support. Mode 5 is the new one. Trade analysts now have more sophisticated measures of trade. We have the tools to look more deeply into what is traded and where value is being added to a good before it's exported. And so we can see that the share of services embodied in exports is higher than the exports of pure services. Note in these examples of Mode 5, that is services embodied in goods, that up to 40% of the value of a GM Volt is the 10 million lines of computer code that make it work. So back to NAFTA and deeper into the weeds. Rules of origin define what is required for a free trade agreement, in a free trade agreement, for goods to be originating within the free trade area and hence qualify for tariff preferences. It's not simple where the parts of a final product come from. When the final parts of the product are coming from all over, it's not simple to decide whether that car would originate in any particular free trade area. An engine originating in Mexico, a suspension originating in the United States, assembled with a transmission made in Canada, could end up in a car that qualifies for the NAFTA preferences. And all of those are things. They're trade in goods, not trade in services. The current NAFTA rule of origin, allowing autos and parts to enter duty-free among the three countries, requires 62.5% of the car to be NAFTA, based largely on a tracing list of physical parts typically found in cars of the 1990s, like this cassette deck. The US wants to move to 85%, and 50% has to be American content. Scotiabank, in a really good analysis, said that's a solution in search of a problem because North American content is actually already higher than the US imagines. The US NAFTA proposal is intended to bring production and investment back to the United States. The US industry hates it just as much as Canada and Mexico do because it would completely disrupt the supply chains they've built that crisscross the border multiple times. The even bigger risk is since the tariff on parts and cars brought into the NAFTA area from the rest of the world is only 2.5%. If you start raising the costs in NAFTA, then offshore suppliers, for example, from Asia, will simply jump the tariff and ignore NAFTA production altogether. Canada is attempting to reframe the rules of origin issue as a modernization issue. We want to replace tracing with focused tracking so there would be less red tape for companies. We want to encourage North American research and development. This is where you start getting towards Mode 5 services being counted under an NAFTA rule of origin. The main thing is we want to encourage North American development and production of advanced automotive technologies. This is where the jobs of the future are, and we with the Americans would like them to be based in North America, but you can't do it by playing games with the 1990s rules of origin. There's no sign yet that Lighthizer will accept our ideas. NAFTA's rules on government procurement, which Mr. Lighthizer mentioned, are weak. The WTO rules are actually more important and more up to date in this area. Democrats in Congress are with Mr. Lighthizer. They want much stronger provisions to ensure that, say, contracts for public infrastructure go to American firms, not Canadian or Mexican firms. Steve Verhoeven, our chief negotiator, said in public that the Buy American proposal may well be the worst ever put forward in a trade negotiation. The president keeps saying that Canada is unfair on agriculture, although the United States has a surplus on agricultural trade with Canada, including on dairy. But they want the elimination of supply management. Of course, they also provide significant support to their own dairy farmers, and they don't talk about where the reciprocity might be on that one. The access that they got in the TPP negotiations was probably good enough at the time for the US dairy industry, although new issues have arisen since. In short, this is an endgame issue. It'll get traded off in the overall package. Lighthizer has asked, what sovereign nation would trust to arbitrators or the flip of a coin their entire defense against unfair trade? He's referring to the 3 dispute settlement chapters. Chapter 11, one that matters to Democrats in Congress, allows arbitration of disputes between investors and states. In the last round, what I heard, this hasn't been said publicly, is that the Americans may have said that US firms should be allowed to sue the Mexican and Canadian governments, because that's important for Republicans in Congress, but Canadian and Mexican firms could not sue the US government. I think the negotiators laughed when they heard that one. Chapter 19 provides for the review of anti-dumping decisions. Lighthizer and his trade remedy colleagues probably hate this more than anything else. Hasn't been used that much in recent years, but it's very important for Canadians. Chapter 20 is for interpretation of the agreements. Canada claims that the proposals on Chapter 19 and on Chapter 20 would effectively make the agreements unenforceable. There's deadlock on this for now. So here we are. We're in a renegotiation at the demand of the US. We're happy to modernize the agreement. That's what we did in TPP, and trade negotiators know how to do that. But the trade deficit is another matter. The US position is based on bad economics. It's aimed quite explicitly at harming Canada and Mexico. So it's a conundrum. Can this circle be squared? Well, the second trade negotiator's cliche is that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. That is, the overall package is going to matter, all the trade-offs, the things that we're going to have to swallow, because there's something else that we can make the Americans swallow. What's not clear is there a compromise that will satisfy all three governments, but equally the stakeholders in all three countries, not least the different sides in the US Congress? And that leads to part 6 of my story. Can we be bullied? How should we analyze the possibilities? We haven't really ever been here before. Modernize is straightforward. We did it in TPP, the benefits for all three partners. But renegotiation may be impossible if it means we have to make more damaging concessions to Trump. The one leads to a new model for North American integration. The other leads to disintegration, which is what may save us. We can be bullied if the US is united. That is, if the US as a whole would win from bullying us. They won't. Indeed, what Trump wants would be damaging for the US. So how do we think this plays out? I could use my whole time just talking about the reactions to the bizarre announcements that were made last week on steel and aluminum, but I just want to address one aspect. If we don't make the deal on NAFTA, we'll start all over again. So the president is pretty clear in linking NAFTA and the exemption on these tariffs. Lighthizer was even more explicit. The exemption, he thought, is an incentive for Canada and Mexico to get the deal done in April so that we can keep the exemption. In other words, the tariffs are simply another attempt to get leverage, to bully us. That they're doing it to all their other supposed allies doesn't change the problem for Canada. The message from Trudeau and Freeland so far is this makes no difference for our NAFTA stance. Canadians have been worried since the election that we can get pushed around by Trump. From the PM on down, the answer consistently is we're not going to be pushed around. Most amazing speech by Steve Verhoeven, the chief negotiator, in February. It had to have been on instructions from the Prime Minister's office. He said in public, with the cameras going, we have no choice but to continue to impress on the US that this cannot be a winner-take-all agreement. They're looking to strengthen the US, and by doing that, weaken Canada and Mexico within the North American economy. A positive outcome for all three countries is possible, he's saying, but not if renegotiation implies capturing more of the benefits for the United States at the expense of the others. I think Canadians are with the government. On the left, you can see that close to half of Canadians think that NAFTA has benefited the country. Few Canadians think it's hurt us. And it's not particularly a partisan issue, although the NDP might be a little bit less positive about NAFTA than Liberals and Conservatives. In trade negotiations, the attractiveness of a large and rich market like the US is powerful, but Trump and Lighthizer misunderstand it. It's only powerful as an inducement, not as compulsion. Trump sees himself in his country as really powerful, but he can't compel us to take an agreement that would be not in our interest. One of the constraints on him is that Congress has enormous influence on trade negotiations. And getting legislation through Congress always requires compromise that involves pro-trade groups of Democrats as well as Republicans. It's always complicated to get to 218 votes in the House and 60 in the Senate. But lobbyists have huge influence on Congress, and elections are a factor, as we saw on Tuesday, and we will see in the fall. You've all seen maps like this one. In blue is Canada's the biggest trading partner for dozens of states. Business lives this reality, and so they keep on saying to the government and they keep on saying to members of Congress, do no harm. Equally important, the dark orange shows states where Canada is the #1 agriculture export market. Farmers depend on exports to Canada, and despite what Trump says, farmers keep saying to their members of Congress and the President, do no harm to NAFTA. The Canadian government started off well, energetically seeking friends wherever we can find them in the US. They keep on doing that. Freeland is in Washington again this week. When the Prime Minister was in Washington in October, he explicitly recognized the role of Congress by showing up. And the chairman of the Powerful Ways and Means Committee was at pains to make it clear, and more recently, that Congress is not going to abrogate its constitutional responsibility and prerogatives on trade. In this picture from the Mexico round, Freeland is meeting with the US congressional delegation. Our ideas on how to reframe or modernize the rules of origin on automobiles were presented directly to congressional committees last month, which irritated Lighthizer. Most Republican senators favor trade agreements, especially senators from farm states. There are Democrats who agree with the Republican mainstream, but there are Democrats, especially from steel states, who are probably closer to the president's position. On steel, aluminum, NAFTA, there are lots of noises of opposition. There are bills being introduced in Congress. For the moment, it's not clear that any of them would succeed if the congressional leadership allowed a vote to take place. But the politics is interesting. Trump says Canada is not fair to the United States, but when asked, nearly 80% of Americans don't agree. They think Canada is fair. We know from polling that Americans generally support trade agreements, but NAFTA as a brand is toxic. These sorts of questions are really tricky, but note that while overall support for NAFTA is up, that's the black line, Republican support, that's the red line, is down. And you'd never guess the Democrat number in blue from the comments of party leaders. So how is this going to play in the midterms? In November, Americans elect all of the House and a third of the Senate. Half of Americans oppose the steel and aluminum tariffs. But the partisan divide is clear here too. 2/3 of Republicans think that the US could win a trade war. 90% of Democrats disagree. Okay, my last section. What happens next? I see at least 5 scenarios. The first, it's been out there from the beginning, Trump just gets frustrated. He says, I'm pulling out of NAFTA. And it's a provision that lets him say, I'm out in 6 months. He could do it because he believes it. He could do it because he thinks it's a negotiating tactic. It could happen if the April round fails, and if he thinks the prospects of going anywhere after that are bleak. If he did that, Mexico would walk out. It would be hard for Canada to stay. The likely congressional reaction to such folly would probably constrain the president. If he was actually to make good on pulling out of NAFTA, Congress would have to repeal all of the implementing legislation that makes NAFTA work. So this is not a plausible scenario, I don't think, or maybe I just hope. The second scenario, a negotiated conclusion in April so that it can get through Congress this year. That's why Lighthizer had a sudden sense of urgency at the end of the March round. This continues to seem implausible to me based on the wide gaps on the most contentious issues that I've just described. Trade deals take time. But if Lighthizer is worried about Democrats winning the House in November, and after this week maybe he should be, then he may want to get his view of an NAFTA renegotiation done and through Congress now, because who knows what could get through Congress next year. And that's not even thinking about who might win the Mexican presidency in the negotiation on July 1st. But they could decide to pause in April and pick up again in the summer, knowing who the new Mexican government would be. I think this is the most implausible scenario. Congressional consideration under Trade Promotion Authority could only start in late summer under such a scenario, which means it would be going to Congress as the midterm campaigns were heating up, which I just can't see that happening. And anyway, the New Mexican government might say, hey, we want to come to the table and we want to understand where things are. So that would be a very slow process. So maybe technical discussions carry on past April through the summer and the fall while we wait for all the elections to get out of the way. And that may be the most plausible, because if you don't do it that way, then you risk, the president risks having to own the NAFTA results, whether the deal has gone south or whether there's a new deal being proposed. He has to own it in the midterms. He has to explain it. Somebody's going to be mad at him no matter what, so he might prefer to go into the fall saying, I'm fighting hard for a better NAFTA deal. Those nasty Canadians and Mexicans are holding me up. Lighthizer has threatened that yet a fifth scenario, that we just walk away from it all and we'll do bilateral deals separately with Canada and Mexico. It's a really bad idea for global value chains. Canada and Mexico have both said, no, we're not going to do that. There is a respectable line of argument that says, actually, none of those scenarios matter. The uncertainty that's being created means Trump's winning anyway. He wants to bring jobs and investment home. He doesn't care, actually, how he does it. And uncertainty could well work as well as anything. Some people think it's affecting the dollar. Probably not. The Canadian dollar typically follows commodity prices, so there's no evident NAFTA effect going on with the dollar. But as the governor of the Bank of Canada, nicely dressed in his Queen's jacket, said across the road on Tuesday, while the empirical work on the original NAFTA is not clear, so the effect of losing it equally is not clear and would be really hard to model at this stage, we can see the uncertainty dampening investment. It might be affecting business confidence. And indeed, there was a story this week that the aluminum industry, looking at the state of tariffs and the state of NAFTA, said, maybe we'll wait before making any big investments in Canada. So maybe Trump wins. Export Development Canada did a survey in the fall, and about a quarter of exporters said that NAFTA talks do have a negative effect on their operations. And of that group, of that quarter of exporters, fully a quarter thought that they're thinking about moving operations to the United States. So Canada would like to get this done quickly. The question is, can we? The willow bends, it accommodates. The rock doesn't. So it's a willow. We should be willing to move quickly on NAFTA to please Lighthizer. But I think we should also be clear that we're not going to be pushed around. For example, we should be planning and maybe even being explicit about a robust response on the steel and aluminum tariffs. This is not the last time that the US schoolyard bully is going to want to eat our lunch, and we have to be firm now, not later. In any negotiation, the stance that you take depends on whether you have an outside option. Do we have one? Is there something else we could do if something happens to our trade with the United States? Well, yes, we do have the World Trade Organization. It's a more modern agreement than NAFTA on many issues. The United States is a member, and much of Canada-US trade could continue to enter the US market duty-free under the WTO. Although new tariffs that would be imposed would have an effect, they're still only about 3%, level of 3%. Not disastrous. Exchange rate fluctuations have a bigger effect on the costs of trading with the United States. But if the United States starts flouting WTO rules, as seems possible, then it invites retaliation from others, which is certainly possible. All of that begins to undermine the trading system, which would be an unprecedented situation for all their trading partners. They might decide to pull out of the WTO at that point. As the WTO Director General said last night, an eye for an eye will leave us all blind and the world in deep recession, so our outside option of the WTO might not be much of an option. So how does Trump declare victory? Renegotiation of NAFTA cannot satisfy the apparent motivations of the president. Trade agreements set the rules, they don't set trade flows. US jobs haven't migrated to Canada. If the objective is to redress damage done to the US economy by trade agreements, then the NAFTA negotiation is going to fail. The modernization issues are mostly going well. Those are the ones that are consistent with the recommendations in our IRPP book. But it's not clear that we're going to be able to reframe rules of origin, for example, as modernization. The renegotiation issues in general are close to an impasse. Lighthizer expects flexibility from Canada on his strong demands while going backwards on issues of interest to us. Enhanced integration remains possible, but North American disintegration is a real risk. This is a tough time. It's tough on NAFTA, on steel and aluminum, and there's no way of predicting where this ends up. But recall what Alan Gottlieb said he learned from his time in Washington as an ambassador during the 1980s. He said he had 2 rules. The first one is, it's not over till it's over. And the second is, it's never over. Thank you very much.